Okay, we got up to, as I recall, did we get past the courtyard into the palace last time? I don't think so.
I think we had just gotten to the point where he kind of received his final helping gift.
Oh, okay. All right. That's
So maybe like just about to reach the palace.
just about to reach the palace. Okay. Thank you, Kelly.
I have a question, but you might not want to answer it at this point. But
Okay.
what does this have to do with character?
Well, because what this has to do with character is that this all has to do with what it means to be, in this case, a princess. What is it that distinguishes her, and what is it that distinguishes the minister who searches for her? What is their particular identity? What are their qualities? So that's one way of thinking about it. Does that help?
For now, I think I want more. I think I want more. The princess thing confuses me more than the minister, because the minister, I mean, his character is his persistence.
Persistence is a part of it, but it's not just persistence. He's looking for something else as well. We'll talk more about it.
Okay, good.
All right.
But that's why you're having us read this, right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Okay, so let's say the bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot divrei Torah. Amen. All right, so we read, so it was that the minister traveled through the entire realm, I think, didn't we? Yes, comes to a big city, right. Okay, we read that part. Okay, and so we're going to, for some reason it's not scrolling. There we go. Come on, little guy. At the bottom of this page, I can't see what the page number is, paragraph that starts, when he went and did as she said. Okay, so let's pick it up there. And can I get somebody to read?
Sure. The when, is that where you'd like me to start?
When he went and did as she
when
said.
at last?
No, next paragraph.
Then he went and did as she said. And on the last day of the long year, he saw for the first time a spring whose waters were reddish and whose smell was that of wine. The minister pointed out the spring to his servant, then went and tasted of its water, only to fall asleep again, and this time he slept for 70 years. Near the end of that time, many soldiers passed by, and the servant concealed himself. But after the troops had passed, a carriage came by in which sat the lost princess. As soon as she recognized the minister, she left the carriage and approached him. And although she shook him very strongly, he did not wake up. And she began to lament, saying that he'd made such a great effort and suffered for so many years to free her. And because of one error on that last day, he had lost everything. She wept greatly over this and then took the scarf from her head and wrote a message on it with her tears and left it next to the sleeping minister. Then she returned to her carriage and drove away.
All right, let's stop there for the moment.
Yeah.
So what do you make out of this water that was reddish and was like wine?
The Nile.
It could be a reference to the Exodus, right? Mm-hmm. The waters of the Nile turning red. That is one possibility. Can we think of another possibility?
What?
We just read about these waters that turned red and were like wine, not just in color, but in terms of their smell and maybe perhaps also their taste. Where do we know a story that where the water turns into wine?
Jesus.
Yeah. So what does this suggest about the nature of these waters? Let's back up. What does it signify that Jesus turned the water into wine. By the way, this is a story from the early in the New Testament, so we're not talking about something much later, medieval, so forth. Jesus was able to turn the water into wine.
Well, that he wasn't a normal man.
He wasn't a normal man. He had certain kinds of powers that just differentiated him, yes. But what's the point of turning water into wine?
I mean, I did think this was part of him proving to the Pharisees that he is the Messiah and that he could do miracles, if I'm recalling
that's a
kind
good
of the
point.
details of the story right.
That's a good start, Kellen, because it has to do with miracles. But what are the miracles? What's the reference of the miracles? What's the relationship of the miracles to us? We're not turning water into wine, are we? Or are we?
Well, there's a reference to the wine. And when you go for communion, that the wine is the blood of Christ or something.
That's true, and so it's a symbol of salvation, right? But in our tradition, what resonates with water and with wine?
I was just thinking of Kiddush with all of this, like
Right.
when you're doing, Shabbat and you drink wine.
Yes. So the wine signifies, with regard to Shabbat, a different quality of the time. Shabbat is a different quality of time. Yes.
Yes.
But water, as a general symbol, connects with what in the Jewish tradition?
Well,
Oh, that's so interesting. Weirdly, this just kind of felt like an aha moment. But I mean, we think of the Torah as being water, and it has this deep symbology. And there's all of this waiting for the Messiah to come, and so this water has evolved, and it's signifying the time of the Messiah.
Right. You're right on point, Kellen. That's exactly where I think, in my personal opinion, how it goes. And how do we encounter ourselves from a personal point of view? Kim just asked the question, why are we reading it? We're not Jesus, we're not the Messiah. What do we have to do with water turning into wine? How does that happen in our lives? If water is Torah, the Mayim Chaim, the living waters, right? What does it mean and how does it happen that water becomes wine? What is the significance of water, which symbolizes Torah, becoming wine?
This is really a guess, but that wine being more about life. So the Torah becomes integrates into our lives.
It does, but I want to get more specific. How? I mean,
It's a transformation.
Yes. What kind of transformation? From what to what?
From grapes to wine. From something.
Well, we're starting with water.
From something concrete to something spiritual.
Okay, we're on the right track. Yes. What do you have in mind when you say that? What is it that we do as human beings? What is our role in the process of transforming water into wine? Is this anything that has to do with us?
A bit of tikkun olam, like the world to come, and also that we have to create that we're creating this messianic age through the realization. This is essentially really simple. It's water. It nourishes you, but now it's become wine.
Nourishes
and there's
us.
no way for us to physically just make water into wine. So there is something deeper, something.
What is it that we do with Torah?
I think
and how do we do this? We turn Torah into what?
I think Nancy's trying to say something.
Oh, I'm
I
sorry,
was
Nancy.
going to say, so the water to wine requires us to do something. We're not passive in that. And so I think the connection is that not that the Torah is passive, but it takes us taking I went ahead to look at the study guide. So I was thinking about, it's a little bit of a cheat, but it takes us looking at our lives and using the words of Torah to transform ourselves in pursuit of tikkun olam.
That's true. Now, there's a step in the middle there, or maybe depending how you look at it, 2 steps that probably need to be made, to be brought to consciousness.
Sure.
How do we engage ourselves or interact with Torah so that we are furthering this process of the transformation of ourselves and the transformation of the world. How do we achieve that? What do we do? What's the actual activity?
We study.
We study it, exactly. And when we study Torah, we are accomplishing both of those things. We are accomplishing the transformation of ourselves because we are acquiring knowledge and understanding and insight, so on and so forth, that can be a part of who we are and how we can change. But then, even more piquantly, perhaps, that becomes the first step or the next step in the changing or the transformation of the world. The point of personal transformation is not to do, as is the case in some traditions, to only affect ourselves as individuals or as human beings, but to go beyond that and to use the change that we encounter because of our study and because of our personal transformation into transforming the world, the community, the society around us. So there's kind of two steps there. So what we're looking at here is a metaphor for how we can understand this process of what it means to study Torah. What does it mean to become engaged in the text? It's not just to understand it ourselves, or it's not even just intellectual. It has an actual real world purpose, real world in the sense that has to do with ourselves as human beings, but also ourselves as actors in the world. Am I being clear?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So this paragraph in the story, to my mind, is a very important one. Okay. Now, there's an interesting metaphor here. This idea of transforming ourselves and the world is likened to what? It tells us. The lost princess does something which is not entirely successful. What does she try to do?
Wake them up.
Wake them up. Yeah, exactly. We even use this metaphor these days now. We say that somebody is woke. All right.
Yeah.
The idea of being awakened is a way of describing what it is like to be engaged with and to be animated by our connection with Torah. You now begin to see things in a different way. So it's not enough to just do the studying. There has to be some, you might say, agitation. Okay. The metaphor I love to use, and I come back to it again and again, is the metaphor of the grain of sand in the oyster. Right, it's the oyster, it's not the clam, right? I'm not big on mollusks. There's a grain of sand that enters into the oyster. And what happens with this grain of sand, and what does it do, and what is the outcome of the sand becoming embedded in the oyster?
A pearl.
Eventually, there's a pearl. What are we talking about here? We're talking about the palace of pearls, right?
Right.
But not to put too fine a point on it, but what is that pearl? What's the process by which the pearl is produced?
Irritation.
Irritation, exactly. My grandmother would have said, "Ungeblasen." We get excited and what's the word I'm looking for? Blown. Ungeblasen means to be blown up, to be agitated. Okay, there is a value to this process of being agitated, of something acting upon us, which brings out ultimately something of great beauty and value, but it does so by means of a process which is irritating and difficult and aggravating and all that kind of stuff. It's not like there is sorry, what?
Each layer of agitation adds to the next layer, adds to the next layer, and adds.
Right.
Started picking up the shards of that we're all supposed to be looking for. It takes more than one person.
Well, I think both of those things are true. There's a process that takes place within us as individuals, but also within us as members of a community or members of a global community. And all of that adds, as you say, layers to the pearl. The pearl gets bigger and more valuable and more beautiful the more irritation there is. Okay? It is perhaps counterintuitive, because in a lot of traditions we might say, well, we're looking for some sort of transformation whereby things get easier, where we're less anxious, we're less upset, we're less irritated or annoyed. But that's not what this is about. This is a celebration of the process of the impact of annoyance and agitation in bringing out the truth, bringing out beauty, bringing out value. It's a different way of reading this process of growth. Growth is not about something easy and seamless and smooth. It's about dealing in a constructive way with things that enter into us which cause irritation. And that's what reading the Torah is like. You read the Torah, and there's tons of stuff that irritates us all the time. And people will say things like, well, why does the Torah teach X? That's terrible. No, the reason it teaches X is because it's supposed to irritate us. It's supposed to make us upset or to act or to do something differently. The Torah is not there to give us some nice, seamless, smooth understanding of how the world works. It's to make us ungeblossen, to get agitated, and in our action in the world, in our interaction with the world. Am I being clear?
Yes, you are. It's just that it does seem to me that in almost any endeavor, you have to go through the hard part.
Yes.
To get to the part that is smooth and comfortable on the other side. And so I think that it's not that you start off with everything being easy. You start off with undertaking the hard part. And so
I think that that's true, Michael, but I want to add what I would consider the next step, which is every time we think that we've reached the level of something that's smooth, what happens? There's more irritation. We don't ever stay in a static way on that level of smoothness or equanimity or whatever. There is also always something that comes along which continues the process of irritation, of change, and so forth. That doesn't ever stop. Hermann Cohen, the 19th century and early 20th century Jewish philosopher, if you're interested in philosophy, he's often called the father of neo-Kantian philosophy. He also did a tremendous amount of work on what we would call Jewish philosophy. And he wrote magnificent works which undergird much of what we understand liberal Judaism to be about. Be that as it may. He says, look, the guarantor of the eternality of the human endeavor, the eternality of life, is that there is no end to the process of moral perfection.
Right.
If we ever got to that point somehow, and our lives became static in that way, we're out of a job. The process continues in an inevitable and eternal sort of way. The world, from Cohen's point of view, doesn't have an end point in the sense that there's some kind of Armageddon or a cataclysm that brings the world to an end. Some religious traditions teach things like that. But every time we think we're at the end, there's another stage, another level of bringing more and more perfection, more and more of the transformation into the world. So here's the point. To use a metaphor that I'm sure some of you, if not all of you, are familiar with. Is anybody here familiar with Zeno's paradox?
is this the one where you have the distance to the wall? Each step is half the distance.
That's exactly right. You have a length, and you go half the length, then you go half the length again, and half the length again, and so forth. And how long does that process go on?
A week or two.
Well, there's a part of me that wishes that it was only a week or two. So far, it's taken me 70 years. I think in the end, here's the irony. It goes on forever because it's always, if you're speaking now, not about using a ruler and so forth, but, actual theoretically having the distance, it is an infinite process. You can always divide the distance by half. You might not be able to represent that with a pencil and a ruler because pencils and rulers have dimensions. But from a theoretical point of view, that's not relevant. In the end, there is always a point at which you can go further. And what we're talking now about is the process is what is called, and I'm no mathematician, so don't get me hung up on this. It's what they call an asymptote. Back when you were taking math in high school, you had an equation with two different radicals, two different unknowns, and you plug in the value for the first unknown and plug in the value of the second unknown, and you plot the points on your graph. And when you plot the points on your graph, what you get is a parabola, a kind of a curved shape, and on one axis of the graph and the other axis of the graph, the A and the B, or the 1 and the 2, how you want to count it, the parabola gets infinitely close to the axis, but it doesn't ever get there. And when it's infinitely close to the axis, it is also, ironically, infinitely far from the axis. You following me? Mm-hmm. That's the way Cohen is suggesting, and I is following him. That's how the world works. We are constantly getting closer and closer, and yet at the same time, further and further away from reaching the goal.
Doesn't that have something to do with our own faulty reasoning? We think the end is there, but when we get there, there's something else beyond that, and on and on and on.
Well, I think that's true. It's maybe a different way to state the same idea, Judith. But what I'm trying to suggest is that this is not the product of our mistakes, of our faultiness, of our lack of logic or thinking clearly. What I'm suggesting is this is embedded in the way the world works. It is, from that point of view, not a mistake, but an inevitable component of the way the world works. It is how, not just the result of our misunderstanding, but it is a product of our understanding. Okay? So I would differ slightly in that regard from what you just said. But yeah, it's true. It is also true that we are often faked out, to use an old term back from my days in junior high school, faked out. We think we've reached the end of the process, and of course we discover that we haven't. When I was a kid, I don't know if anybody had a similar fantasy. I used to fantasize about the invention and the consumption of smart pills. And the idea was that I would take this smart pill and I would get really smart. And I would get closer and closer to knowing what the truth is. And then, of course, it turns out that I still didn't know much. So I had an experience once many years ago when I was at HEC. One of my favorite professors was, may he rest in peace, Gene Borowitz, who's the major philosophical person at the New York School. And one day I had to visit him. I was sitting across from him at his desk in his office. He's on the phone with somebody. And he's nodding and he's saying, yes, I understand. I see what you mean, blah, 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 blah. And the conversation goes on for like 10, 15 minutes. I'm just listening to this. Finally, the conversation is over. He says goodbye. And here's this professor of mine who I think was brilliant and taught me huge amounts of things. He turns to me and he says, that was somebody who really knows something. I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, here's Borowitz, talking about somebody that Borowitz thinks really knows something. And from Borowitz's point of view, he doesn't know all that much, but this guy does. And maybe from the guy's point of view, he knows more. And it's just an ongoing process, if I'm being clear. Okay. So we go through this process of trying to wake up. And there are factors in our lives which lead to us moving along this path. Okay, so let's take the next paragraph. I want to make a little bit more progress before we run out of time. So will somebody read the paragraph that starts not long after?
Sure, I will.
Okay.
Not long after, the minister awoke and asked his servant, "Where am I?" The servant told him all that had happened, about the troops that had passed by there and the carriage that had stopped, and how the lost princess had tried so hard to wake him. "How long have I been asleep?" he asked. "For 70 years, the servant replied. Then the minister saw the scarf and asked, "Where did this come from?" And the servant told him that the lost princess had written on it with her tears. So the minister took it and lifted it up toward the sun and read the message that was written there. It said that she was no longer to be found in the palace of the evil one, but from then on she would make her home in a palace of pearls on a golden mountain, and it was there that he would find her.
Okay, so we're now beginning the quest. And the quest takes the minister in a related but new direction. When he is awake, he is on a different track, moving on a different track. What's the different track? He was previously in the palace of the evil one, but now he's not. He's in the palace of the pearl, which is on a golden mountain. Now, I think this is a pretty nice metaphor for the engagement in Torah.
Mm-hmm.
What's the golden mountain? Oh, you know it. As soon as I say it, you're gonna say I
Heaven?
should have a V8.
Heaven?
Sinai?
Well, you know, there's something to be said for that, Michael. But I want to get to something more basic before we move.
Oh,
How about Austin?
Where the Torah was, where he met God and got the Torah.
right.
Yeah, Mount Sinai, of course.
Ah,
This is about the encounter with God on Mount Sinai when the Israelites received the Torah.
The pearls of wisdom.
There you go. You know, I mean, we're on this route now, which takes us out of the domain of the evil one, so to speak, and into the domain of God. This is God's mountain. You know, that's how the prophets and the Psalms talk about it. What will happen in the end of days? If you grew up with the old Union prayer book, they quoted this. What shall happen in the top of the mountain in the end of days? That many peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, and there God will teach us of his ways. We shall walk in God's paths. And for out of Zion shall go forth the law, the Torah, and the word of God from Jerusalem." So this is a vision not only of receiving the Torah, but of the dissemination of the Torah. The mountain has these two functions, okay? Now, I don't want to get caught up in a rabbit hole here, but I want to mention something. There is an irony here. And the irony is, so is anybody, oh, there's somebody else. I got to stop doing this. I got to stop the doorbell. I'm sorry. I'll be right back.
So everybody's surviving. We've gone back into isolation, having food delivered, et cetera, et cetera.
We have two. I'm making still small ventures out, but very limited and very carefully.
We never stopped.
Forbidden us. Remember when we forbade our children? Our children have forbidden us.
Really?
I tried that with my dad, and he just, I mean, at 90, he's, I want to do what I want to do. He told me, I'm being careful. We're only going to, and then named the places I like. You're a smart man. You know the risks.
Maybe not. Maybe not. We'll see. All right. So let me ask you a question. If you've been to Israel, and you still can do this, there was a time when you couldn't. You can take a trip down to the Sinai, and you can visit the mountain, I put in quotes, which is thought by some to be the actual Mount Sinai. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, who knows. But if you went there to visit, you notice something about Mount Sinai. It's very small. It's not, we're not talking about, Mount Olympus or Mount Fuji or Mount Everest. This is a teeny little hillock. It's kind of, somebody said earlier, it's like being Austin. Yeah, you go to where, what's that place that people like to visit?
Mount Bonnell?
Mount Bonnell. If that's a mountain, I don't know what a mountain is, okay? It's like that. But in the mythology, it becomes this gigantic place, and it is the top of the mountains and so forth. It's how it's described. The Mount Sinai will be the top of the mountains. Well, all right. It's very small, actually. This is a sense of the irony involved. We've encountered this in another way. God gives the Torah to Israel. Is that because Israel is the most populous nation or the most powerful nation or the most important nation or anything of the sort? No, quite the opposite. God gives the Torah to Israel because it is the least important, the least powerful place. The irony is that God is revealed not to greatness, but to humility. Not to being at the height, but being at the bottom. So, and this is a point that's made many, many times in the Psalms. The psalmist says, well, here's a good example. It's a psalm that everybody knows. The 23rd Psalm. Can anybody quote anything from there? The 23rd Psalm?
The Lord is my shepherd, and I shall not want.
I shall not want, yeah.
I don't know anymore.
All right, God leads me by...
lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
No.
That's not it?
Where is this taking place? Where is God leading the speaker of the Psalm?
Waters,
Valley of the
pastures, valley of the shadow of death.
The valley of the shadow of death. This is a low place, okay? Where do we encounter God? We encounter God in places that are low, but they're not really low, they're really high, because God is there. I mean, the whole thing is based on a kind of pulling something inside out, okay? What appears low is really high, and what is really high is really low. If you are the kind of person who thinks you're really hot stuff, are you really hot stuff? No, you're not.
Sometimes.
But if you are humble, you're actually much more likely to be hot stuff. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
So where do we encounter God? We encounter God in the valley of the lowest, which is because it's the valley of not just the valley of death, but the shadow of death. You understand how far removed that is? The valley of the shadow of death. And there we are, and what do we encounter there? We encounter God. Isn't that's got to be at least a little ironic, don't you think? So here we are, this low point, by the way, when do we typically read this particular psalm? I can read it any time. But when do we typically read this psalm?
Funerals.
Where?
At funerals.
At funerals. And how are we feeling at funerals?
Sad, low.
Low. We are low. We are at the bottom. We are bereft. We are stripped of something very important to us that helped to make us who we are. And this has now been taken from us through this process of death. And yet it's at that point that we are lifted up. And what happens? God sets a table for us in the presence of our enemies. And God redeems us in this way. So even though we're at the lowest ebb, we are in the process of being redeemed. One way of looking at this is, if you're familiar with the special blessing for Hanukkah, we don't read it that much in the liberal tradition, and I don't kind of understand exactly why that is. But the point of this particular prayer is that God takes the Israelites who are at their lowest ebb and raises them up. Now, this is an idea that's picked up in Christianity as well. This is one of the things they get from us. The fact, I was just reading a quotation. There's this guy, Deshaun Jackson, who plays wide receiver for the Philadelphia Eagles. And he put up on his Facebook page this bogus quote from Hitler about how the Jews are this and the Jews are that, and he likes Louis Farrakhan and so on and so forth. Very ugly anti-Semitic quote. He's gotten lots and lots of pushback from all sorts of people about it. Okay. But what does he say? He says, I wasn't trying to put the Jews down. I was just trying to lift up the African-American experience. See, here's the point. When we say lifting up, we're trying to raise something to the level of consciousness that was hidden or obscured or overlooked. Overlooked is the right word, as in I'm looking over a four-leaf clover that I overlooked before, right? That's an old song. Some of you may be familiar with it, some of you may not be. The idea is that in the world around us, there are things that are meaningful and important, but they don't appear that way. We have to somehow look more closely in order to recognize how important they are. So, for example, this is one of the many ways in which I wish that the people at Chabad would just pack up and go away. We have this idea of, it's called Pirsum Hanes, the publication or the dissemination of the miracle. What this has to do is we light our menorah and we put it in the window. So that everybody should see the menorah and see that we have lights for the holiday of Hanukkah. It's supposed to be little. It's supposed to be insignificant, apparently, but really, ultimately being very significant. We don't go out and make a big gedillah out of it. We don't have a gigantic menorah we put in the town square. We don't do that. That undermines the point of the metaphor. The metaphor is that it is in the little things that salvation is found, or that meaning is found. And if we do what some people like us to do, they have some kind of giant menorah on the campus. The Chabad people used to do this. Maybe they still do. So the same time of year when they have their Christmas trees and the national lighting of the Christmas tree and so on and so forth, we're going to compete with that with a gigantic menorah. I can't think of anything more out of keeping with the meaning of Hanukkah than something like that. It is a total, perversion, of the message of Hanukkah. All right, but the point I make here is not just about Hanukkah, it is about where we find meaning. Meaning is not located in the gigantic and the big and the important. Meaning is found in the small, the inconspicuous, the not private, but the modest. Okay, this is not acceptable. Okay, I will be right back.
Our dog keeps getting excited hearing the dog bark on the computer.
Oh, thank you. You gotta stop coming. I teach class. I get interrupted every time.
Juniper?
Yeah, Juniper, she keeps going to run to the window to look for the dog.
I'm right here, Junie.
Junie, do you hear Claudia?
All right. They came to deliver my badge because I guess they're worried that being now officially an old person, I will forget who I am. So, okay. Here is, I will give you in a very short form. How are we doing on time, by the way?
15 minutes.
Okay, good. So this is my absolute favorite midrash about any Jewish holiday. It has to do with the structure of the temple in Jerusalem. And it's not an early midrash, it's kind of a late midrash. And we know that it's late because in describing the temple in Jerusalem, it basically is describing a building that is like the Romanesque buildings of late antiquity. So the walls are very thick of the temple in Jerusalem, and there's the lights inside, the menorot, and so on and so forth. And you would say, okay, how would you make the windows in the temple? Well, normally, you would, in Romanesque buildings, the outside opening for a window would be small, and it would open out on an angle so that the opening on the inside was large. Why? So that light that would come in would be disseminated through the interior of the building. And that's normal architecture in that period and other periods as well. But that's not how the Midrash pictures the temple. The Midrash pictures the temple as the openings for the windows being small on the inside, opening out to much larger openings on the outside as it goes to this thick wall. Why is that? Because the function of the temple is to disseminate the light from the menorot inside the temple into the world. You follow me?
Mm-hmm.
It's exactly the opposite of what you would think. It's not practical. It is about a metaphor for how the temple and the activities that take place in it impact the world. It illuminates the world. It's not the other way around. The world is not illuminating it. It is illuminating the world.
Right.
Okay? That's how I know that the Chabad people are wrong about the menorahs. Because the point is, those little candles have meaning because they're little, and despite the fact that they're little, they illuminate the world. Their meaning, their metaphoric meaning, is what illuminates the world. It is the world illuminated by the light of truth, of understanding, of justice, and so on and so forth. And the source is within. Now, this is not just about politics or tikkun olam. It is about that. But it's also about us as human beings. Within us, there is a source of light, of truth, of understanding, of wisdom, and so on and so forth. And what is our job in the world? Our job is to disseminate that into the world, to spread it around. We have to be ourselves the source of light. That happens from connecting to what's within us and creating an opening that will diffuse or disseminate the light. Am I being clear?
Yes.
Okay. This is a very interesting way of thinking about what our purpose in the world is and what the purpose of introspection is. Ultimately, the point of introspection, of self-examination, of looking at who we truly are, is not about us being affected by what's outside, but by us affecting what is outside, from within us and projecting outside of us. This is a very powerful and ironic image of what our purpose as human beings happens to be. Now, I don't want to put too fine a point on it. What does this have to do with Hanukkah, this particular story? And what does it have to do with us? Well, we think of Hanukkah as it being a political holiday, and it was. And without going into chapter and verse and what its politics were, it's about the redemption of the world and the ironic qualities that are part of the redemption of the world. But it's important to note that the source of the light, of the power, of the meaning that leads to redemption outside is within us. That is what makes this meaningful and challenging. And that's why we put these little Hanukkah lights. I mean, think about it. We start out with a menorah, and how many candles are there in the menorah?
In the beginning?
Yeah.
2.
Yeah.
The shamas and the
The
first
shamas
candle.
that we used to light the other, right, okay. And then what happens on the second night? How many do we have?
It expands to 3.
It expands. Exactly the point, Michael, that we start out with something small, even inconspicuous. You've passed by on the street and maybe you don't even notice. But by the end of the holiday, maybe you notice it. It grows. It starts out small and becomes larger. And in the end, that's what our job is.
What about the other guy,
What are the-
Shamal or whoever, who said that you do it the other way?
Shammai.
Yeah,
Shammai and Hillel. Hillel is the one we follow.
yeah.
And the reason is because he understood that the point of lighting these candles is to increase light. It's not to show how little light is left, which was Shammai's
Right.
point. You know, there's something that sometimes people call zero-sum thinking, okay? You have a certain quantity of something, and we approach it as something that is going to become lessened each time we use it or connect with it or whatever it is. I mean, people think about that in terms of, let's say, the amount of oil or petroleum that's in the world. As it turns out, that may not be true, but be that as it may. So that we've got some resource and there's less and less of it over time. That's one way of looking at how the world works. But that doesn't get us very far. Where did it get us? If we think that there's a resource and all we can say about it is it becomes less and less over time, then where does that lead us? It leads us to nothing.
Well,
So-
almost nothing.
Sorry?
We never get to the end, so it's almost nothing.
Well, okay, close enough. Close enough for government work. Yeah. Okay. And so the idea is when it comes to resources, what do we do in order for resources to be of real value to us? We come up with other ways of accomplishing the same thing. We find, for example, here's a good example. We'll end on this for today. So years ago, there was a book about the dwindling resources and the population bomb and all sorts of stuff. And eventually there was going to be not enough food in the world for everybody to have food. Okay. And so we came up with this idea that we had to, you should pardon the expression, husband nutritional resources. Until Norman Borlaug came around. Anybody know the name Norman Borlaug?
Nope.
You look at him on Wikipedia. Norman Borlaug won the Nobel Prize for inventing a kind of wheat called short stalk wheat. And what he did was he solved the problem of why there wasn't going to be enough wheat or grain in the world. Because what would happen is you'd have normal sort of stalks of wheat, and if you try to increase the yield of actual grains of wheat, the stalk would like fall over, and it would get it would degenerate, it would get waterlogged, whatever it is. So you couldn't grow too much wheat because you would wind up with the wheat degenerating, and you'd have less than you need. Norman Borlaug invented a short stalk wheat plant, which is able to bear many times more grains of wheat than wheat stalks had for umpty years, starting from the first time people began to cultivate wheat. So countries, for example, like India, all of a sudden had enough wheat to feed all their people. Now, what happened was that Borlaug changed the economics or the structure of nutrition by creating a different reality for wheat, okay? Not something that we knew in advance was going to happen or that we could have predicted necessarily. Mm-hmm. Although obviously he was working on this for a while before he actually developed the plant. Turns out that things change, and they don't always change in a degenerative way, but sometimes they can change in a positive way as new possibilities come online. Can we think of any other examples like this? Well, energy is a good example. We are coming up with new ways to create energy, sunlight and wind and so on and so forth, things that were not even thought of as being serious sources of energy. And we look at the old fossil fuel kind of stuff and we say, well, you know what? We don't have to worry about there being dwindling resources of fossil fuel, because in a few years, who's going to be using that? Mm-hmm. They'll be replaced by all this other stuff. What I'm saying is that in the end, what Torah is about and what we human beings are about is the increase of light in the world. That's what our job is. And it happens in many ways, and it happens in ways that we can't necessarily always anticipate. All right. Should probably stop here for today before I go into another rant. So we should meet again, I think, in 1 week, if that's all right with everybody. And
sounds good.
I'm glad you're enjoying it. Thank you. I'm enjoying working with you on this. So let's pick it up again with the giant. Is that okay with everybody?
Yeah.
All right.
And
so
do we
Shabbat,
that address, that Avenue C address to send you things?
No. I don't live there anymore.
I was wondering, because it still says that. What address would you like us to send?
No, we're just going to use a PayPal address, the Rabbi Baker 2.
I have a gift for.
Okay.
All right, my physical address is
here. I'll send that out.
Okay, Kim, thank you. That would be very helpful.
Okay,
I appreciate that. Okay. All right, have a good Shabbos, everybody, and we'll talk again next week.
Great, thank you.
Right
Good
up.
Shabbos.